I wish you a wonderful day and welcome to the OXL YouTube channel. In this video, we'll take a look on how to enable NFTables on a freshly installed system and how we can interact with the configuration of NFTables, runtime configuration file. Also, we will take a look on how to catch configuration errors and validate configuration. Alright, let's get into it. When we now check the status of our NFTable service, we see that it is still disabled and not running. If we check the running rule set of NFTables, we get an empty reply because no rules are loaded and the firewall is disabled for now. When we now start the NFTable service, the default rule set will get loaded and we will see a running rule set. We will also enable the NFTable service, of course, so it gets started at boot time whenever we reboot the system. Yeah, the state of the service is okay. I'll talk about the exited state a little later on. Now we have a running rule set and the firewall is active. We'll now take a look at the default service file to understand how the service works and why it is in the state exited when it is active. We'll take a look at the start, reload and stop actions. The start and reload action simply load the configuration file, the main configuration file. The NFT command line tool is a user space utility that sends the configuration to the firewall that is running at kernel space. This is why we see that the service is in state exited whenever the firewall is active, because we have no process at user space level running. We'll now see how this works with the reload, because reloads should flush the existing rule set and load the new one. This works by adding a flush rule set at the top of the main configuration file. So whenever the configuration gets loaded, the old one gets flushed and the new one gets loaded into the firewall at kernel level. Exactly. The flush rule set is also executed by the stop. So if we stop the firewall service, all rules get removed. Now let's take a look at the default configuration file. What's in there? We have one table of type inet. Inet means it handles IPv4 and 6 traffic, and filter is just a generic name for the table. We by default have 3 chains, the input, forward and output chain, which also are hooked to input, forward and output. We'll talk about hooks later on in another video in detail. If there is no default policy defined at chain level, it will be the default policy except. We also see this when we execute NFT list rule set. Now let's take a look at the configuration validation. We can use the NFT command line utility using the flex CF to validate a configuration file. In this case, the configuration file will be valid and nothing happens. But if we add some invalid syntax, some random input, so to say, it will show us an error. The errors shown by the configuration validation are pretty generic sometimes, but it helps debugging the configuration pretty well. What now happens if we restart the service at the time when the configuration is invalid? When we reload the service, the action will fail. But if you check the status of the service, it's still active. And if we now check the running rule set of NFTables using the nft-list rule set command, the previous rules are still here. We here can also see the default policy that is not configured in the configuration file. Sometimes the running configuration is also a little different than the configuration inside the configuration file, because also if you use variables, they will be resolved. So you see a list of IP addresses instead of a list of variables, for example. Okay, what now happens if we restart the service and at the time where the configuration is invalid? If we restart the service, we have a problem, at least by default. So the status of the service is failed, and if we check the running rule set, it's gone. This is because, as we've seen before, the stop action of the NFTable service is to flush the rule set. So it gets flushed at the restart, and after that it would be loaded again, but it couldn't be loaded because the configuration is invalid. If we want to catch such errors on service restart, we can do so by adding a systemd override. First, we create the override directory at etc systemd system NFTables service D, and after that we add an override conf file inside that directory. Now, this is an example on how we can configure it. Basically, the exec stop override catches the error. The exec start pre and reload are not necessary. I personally like to add them anyways, just to have a configuration validation step whenever NFTables loads a configuration. Yeah, exactly. This way, the configuration validation action at exec stop will fail, and the flush rule set will not get executed. To activate these changes, we execute a systemd daemon reload to load the change in the service, and we can now remove the invalid syntax from the configuration file just to get NFTables started again, and then we can re-add the configuration error and test our changes. So just re-add it and try to restart NFTables. We see the service is still in failed state because the exec start did not work. But if we check our running config, the rule set is still loaded, so the firewall is still active, even if the service failed. Now I have one more tip for you. If you want to use some advanced features of NFTables, it might be necessary to load the specific kernel module for this feature. NFTables has a lot of kernel modules, and in the documentation linked in the description down below, you can also find some commands to find out which kernel modules are enabled in your distribution. You see, there are many features and not all are loaded by default depending on your distribution and distribution version. If the required kernel module is not loaded, you might get a pretty generic error when validating your configuration. Alright, this is pretty much it of the basics. We now have NFTables installed, enabled, and can start to configure it in the next video. If you have some advanced questions or need professional support, feel free to contact us. And for now, have a nice day and servus.